if you would be so kind, turn with me to the 1 Corinthians, or if you don't have your Bible, like I don't, there it is. If you don't have it, it's 2018. You can Google it. Just Google 1 Corinthians. I'm sorry, it is 2019. But you know what? Google, it still works, right? So just Google it. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We're going to look at a few verses here as we continue the trail of what in the world is this thing that we're going to participate for the first time in together next week called communion, or the Lord's table, or the Eucharist, or I can't think of any other names for it. But that thing, what is it? Why are we doing it? Do we need to do it? What's the benefit of it? How does it work? And all of those questions hopefully are getting quasi-answered, because it is important. It is something that stabilizes and nourishes the church that God has given to the church for the nourishment of the people. But there's also a very, very important way in which you do it, and there's a way in which you don't do it. And so we've been looking at those things, preparing ourselves, warning ourselves in a sense, before we just haphazardly come and participate in it next week. Trying to be as responsible as possible. So we were looking at 4 different kind of elements of the Lord's table. The first one was remembering. Where in the world does this thing even come from? And we saw how from the Old Testament, God had provided redemption for His people in Egypt through the Passover. And then thousands of years later, Jesus celebrates the Passover on the night that He's betrayed. And from the Passover, He makes the whole thing about Himself. He says, actually, that Passover was pointing to my Passover, when I'm going to take the brunt of God's wrath and you're going to be safe. And then last week we looked at an incredibly immense topic, and that is community. Communing with God and also communing with each other. And we looked at what a healthy community looks like and what a non-healthy community looks like. And today, we're going to swim around in some different things, but the overall kind of thing is presence. Like, when we come to the King's table, what's so spiritually unique, almost mystical about the table is that Christ is present at the table in a way that He's not in other facets of our lives. Now there are we won't go into that. But there are different ways in which that's been interpreted. We won't get into that today. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week. But that's what we're doing. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Look at it, verse 14. 1 Corinthians 10, starting at 14. Paul says, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as the sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread. We who are many are one body, for we all partake of one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That foods offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons." Thank you, Paul. "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He?" Father, You are our teacher. Would You be our teacher today? Would You inform our hearts and our minds and our bodies about what it means to be present with You at this table? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. The Christian life, if you've been a Christian, or you're considering being a Christian, let me just be honest with you, it's filled with ups and downs. Turmoil, sadness, joy, prosperity, despair. It has all of these different emotions. And the question is, sometimes it's overbearing on one side or the other. And what it does typically is it causes us to feel like sometimes God and I, however you say it, like we're cool, we're good right now, but in other times I feel like God is way distant from me. I feel like I'm just orbiting somewhere out in the atmosphere and He's nowhere to be found. And Christian people live in this tension. So if you're a Christian and you feel like this today, or you felt like this, let me just relieve your tension here. Like, that's normal. That's a very normal experience to have. The question is, why do we feel like that? Why is this emotional roller coaster so much a part of the Christian experience? Well, thoughtful people have compared in the past essentially the Christian life to the life of an athlete. Specifically, Christian discipline or spiritual discipline to the same discipline that an athlete would have. I mean, Paul does it himself in the chapter before in 1 Corinthians 9. He says, "Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Herein lies, I think, the heartbeat of why we feel so disconnected to God sometimes, and why we feel so connected. Why we feel like His presence is very near to us, and when we feel like His presence is very far from us. The heartbeat of that is our spiritual discipline. Our ability to discipline ourselves. Because in reality, He's not far from us. In reality, He doesn't distance Himself from us, but we distance ourselves from Him. And usually, it's in the realm of spiritual discipline. Spiritual discipline I even hate putting it like this, but like as a study, actually, as a study or as a subject has really evolved post-Enlightenment, right, in the past couple hundred years, right? Or we could say it's devolved in a sense. Spiritual discipline has gone from what we do in the Christian life, right, or the habits that we form, to what we think about the Christian life. See the difference? It's not so much about the training, the disciplining of ourselves, it's more about what we are thinking. It's the right thoughts are better than right actions. This is why, if I may probe for a second, much of our church experiences are us coming in and consuming something and then leaving, right? But then once we leave, like there's no life application. There's no, how do I grind this down into my everyday life? It's just now that I know something new about the Bible or theology, now I'm more spiritually disciplined. And my friends, that's just not true whatsoever. It doesn't help. Now listen, knowing right things is important. I mean, we spend a bulk of our time together on Sundays looking and learning things from the Bible. So I'm not saying learning is not important. I'm not saying that renewing our mind in that sense, like what we talked about a couple weeks ago, is not important. But what I'm saying is, right knowing has to influence right living. Otherwise, what's the point? There is no point. If what we're learning is not so true that it doesn't impact and make our soul sing so beautifully that it changes the way that we live, there's no point to it. There is 0 point. And in a lot of ways, I love Paul's comparison because our spiritual discipline and our physical discipline, or our spiritual nature, our spiritual side of us and our physical side of us, there's a lot of similarities between the two, right? There's a lot of similarities. I mean, our physical bodies on a daily basis require some kind of nourishment with the right foods to perform in a way in which we need to perform, right? And our spiritual lives really work much the same way. We need the right food, the right nourishment, so that we can perform the way we've been created to perform. But just learning about the food is different than tasting the food. Just knowing about the food is different than actually eating it and digesting it and then using its nutrients. It's incredibly different. So where is the nourishment found? Yes, individual Bible study, individual learning more about theology, reading good books, Yeah, those are great things. But where is it? Where is the feast? Like where is the nourishment that we need as a community to be able to know the right things and live the right way? It's only at the King's table. Is it because for some reason the bread is just more holy here, right? Or the wine or the grape juice, regardless of whatever denomination you are, right? Now all of a sudden it's more nourishing. No, because behind those things, God Himself, the King Himself, Christ our Savior is present. It's His presence that nourishes us. It's His presence that our soul feasts on in a very real way. So this is Paul's main point. The King's table provides nourishment for His people. Like, we desperately need His nourishment. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to deconstruct this a little bit. Like this statement. The King's table provides nourishment for His people. I want to deconstruct it and then kind of interact with it a little bit. And it will be so much fun. You're going to love it. Here's the first point, I think. The first point of consideration you're thinking about is this. Like, we're always looking for spiritual nourishment. Whether you're religious or not, you're looking for spiritual nourishment. And in fact, there's a danger in talking about spirituality like we do today, or talking about religion like we do today. And that's this. What we do when we talk about it as a singular category is we make it a singular category, right? I have my job, I have my family, I have my hobbies, I have my religion, I have my spirituality. But in reality, spirituality is not a facet of life. It's not one of the compartments on the utility belt, right? It's not a part of life, it's the entire life. Why? Because we are entirely spiritual beings. Like, everything about us is spiritual. We process everything. We admire everything. Some things we are repulsed from because we're deeply connected to a realm outside of this realm. We are deeply and utterly spiritual people. Well, time out for a second, because that may beg the question. Okay, all right, maybe. So look, maybe you're not a Christian. You're like, hey, that's weird. That's too far. I don't know about that. Well, I mean, consider this for a second. If there's not a spiritual component to us, right? If there is a spiritual component, that spiritual component needs to be fed. It needs to be fostered in the same way that our body would need to be fed and fostered, right? But is that spiritual component there? Well, I think that you can make a good case that it is, because if it's not there, if we're alone, if all that's real is what we can see, then why do we have so many questions that revolve around things that we just don't have answers to? Or we have so many questions about things like the meaning of life. Why are we always asking the meaning of life? If ultimate reality was in what we could see and feel and taste and touch, why are we always looking for more? Or maybe it's just me. And I'm okay being the only weirdo, but I don't think I am. I think we're always looking for something more. We're always trying to derive meaning and things like that. We're always trying to find significance in things. And from a Christian perspective, there's a great hope in this internal dialogue, right? And that great hope is this, that God has made us, put us in this world with the purpose of knowing Him. And He's not a human being. He's a spirit. He's deeply spiritual. And so there's something inside of our spirit that cries out to know the ultimate spirit, to know God. And what separates Christianity really from every other religion is that this deep cry has an ultimate fulfillment. It's not just in theory, because that God moves then towards us. He reveals Himself to us. He shows Himself to us. He makes Himself tangible to us. Because we're deeply spiritual people. We're always looking for spiritual nourishment. Okay, time in. So I think that's why Paul starts off the way that he does in kind of an emphatic way. Right? He starts off with this command in verse 14. Flee from idolatry. Get away from idolatry. Don't be amongst idolatry. I mean, he commands the church to flee from idolatry. Let that sink in for a second. Right? Remember, Paul's not talking to some, nasty heathen pagan people, right? He's talking to who? The church. And what does he say? Leave your idols alone. Get away from them. Stop running to them. Wait a second. Church people don't act like that, right? Church people are the good people. Church people don't have idols. Please, you just don't know any church people, right? You have idols everywhere, right? What is an idol? Well, there's a sense in which, yes, it's a tiny wooden figure, right, at times, or clay little. An idol is a representation of a god. Idolatry, then, is going to that idol to find some kind of satisfaction in that God, to provide some kind of hope, some kind of sustenance for your spiritual nourishing. And we all have these idols. No, they're probably not little wooden statues, right, of Baal or Chemosh, or, there's not these ancient deities. Maybe some of that. But idols don't have to necessarily take the form of little statues. They can also be other things. They can also be really good things. And let me emphasize that. Idols can be really good things. In Katy, Texas, we have idols all over the place, and we don't necessarily think of them as idols. Some of the idols in Katy are our kids, our jobs, our body image. Like, these are things we look to and think, if I have this, then I will be complete. Then my life will have meaning. And what we do is we take those things, we put them up on our shelf, and every day, with all of our might and power, we bow down to them. And we say, you are my God. You are going to please me. You're going to satisfy me. We all do it. I don't know what your idols are, but I know that they're there. I know that mine are there. We're not very good at hiding them. Sometimes we can think we are. But an idol can be anything. So how do you identify your idols? Right? Like, because some of you, I'm assuming, are thinking, well, I wonder what my idols are. Well, on our website, under the info tab, and then click down to resources, I put a document on there that Jeff Metters, a pastor in the Tomball area, had done this collaboration effort. We put together a document on helping people identify their idols, but essentially boiling it down. The document, how do we find out our idols, is by asking really two questions, two fill-in-the-blank questions. It's this. If I were to ask you, fill in the blank, life only has meaning if whatever that blank is, life only has meaning if this is true, or if I look like this, or if I have that. Chances are, those are good indications of where your heart affections may be, where you're trying to get spiritual nourishment. Life has meaning if I have this, or I only have worth when my health is good, when I'm being promoted at work, when my kids are being obedient, when people in the community think I'm valuable, when people think I'm attractive. Like, whatever your fill-in-the-blank in is, you have a fill-in-the-blank, first of all. You have something that you're thinking of, that you put there. And the reality is, if it's not God Himself, my friends, you have an idol problem. Just like me. Just like everyone else. And that's what Paul's saying. I said, man, this is a very prickly text. That's a really harsh way to start. One theologian in the past, one of my Uncle John Calvin, he said this. Sorry, that was a Christian joke, sorry. John Calvin says this: our hearts are essentially idol-making factories. That's what our hearts do. We have such a deep longing for spiritual nourishment and fulfillment, and our hearts, because we're fallen, takes the driver's seat and says, I'll show you spiritual nourishment. I'll show you where you can find it. And it drives us directly to wherever we're filling in the blank. And we bow down to that bad boy, and we worship that bad boy, and we We serve those idols and we try so hard to fulfill that need we have, but it doesn't work. You know why? Because idols don't give. Idols only take. You want to worship your job? You think you're going to get this sense of significance from your job, and you pour yourself into your job, and you're working overtime, and you're forsaking your family, and you're giving everything else up so you get promoted, and you finally reach the top, and guess what? That idol says, look, you did a good job. Are you happy? And you say, I'm not. It's dated now, and it's probably not even true anymore, but my favorite illustration of that was always Tom Brady's, right? Tom Brady, the GOAT, you know him? It was always, exactly. It was always, when he was on, I don't know if it was when he was being interviewed after, I can't remember what Super Bowl it was. It was like 17 or 20, I can't remember. Well, it was one of those, but he was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked him, are you satisfied now? And you know what he said? Ring full of fingers. I think he was MVP that year. You know what he said? No. Didn't you know what he said? There's got to be more than this. And I think, while we may not play in the NFL, to a large degree, we feel that. Idols take, they do not give. They demand more and more and more, and you get less and less and less. But my friends, there's good news. There is good news in this. And Paul brings it out early, which you need to after you start off like that. He says this in look at 15. Actually, just skim through 15 through 18 and notice something that he does. He draws a comparison between what's happening at the king's table, at the Lord's Supper, and what idol participation is, or what idol worship is. When you worship an idol, you're participating with that idol. You're saying, I want this, give me this. And that idol takes and takes and takes from you, but you're participating with it. And Paul says, look, you guys have been called to something greater, something mightier, something way more fulfilling. You have been called to participate not with an idol that takes from you, but from a God who gives to you. You participate with Him. You can't go back to worshiping your idols. Like, this is a tremendous amount of hope. Because essentially, here's what Paul is saying. Where idols take from us and take from us and take from us until we die, Christ, God Himself, gives to us and gives to us and gives to us until He dies. No idol sacrifices themselves for you. You sacrifice for the idol. But God Himself willingly, out of His abundance, sacrifices for us to give us nourishment that we're really looking for. And God's been doing this since the beginning of time. That's why Paul uses the example of Israel. God has been nourishing His people in different means and ways, but the substance has always been the same. It's always been pending on Christ Himself. That's why Christ is the King. He's the host. He's the significant one. That's why the Lord's Supper is all about Him. That's why what we need most to satisfy our spiritual longings for nourishment is His presence. That's what we need. When we go to our idols, that's what we're looking for, but we just never find it. Why? Because it's not there. Yet, oftentimes, right, when our faith is weak, when disruptions in life occur, when we don't believe, when it's hard to believe that, more times than not, even if we're completely convinced that that's true, we are very quick to return to faux nourishment. We know we need good nourishment, but we quickly return to faux or fake nourishment. We return to these idols. Why? Because old habits die hard. Can we just be real about that for a second? Like, old habits die hard. And if they don't die hard, you have probably just gotten really good at hiding them. Because a lot of times, unfortunately, in the Christian life, it's not so much about you getting over certain sins or things like that. It's about you becoming better at hiding them. But see, the King's table invites us not to hide. but yet we still really struggle with that. Corinth is a really unique place. It's a really cool place in the ancient world. I mean, it's a transient city. It's a port city. So you have a vast amount of different cultures there, vast amount of religions. But they were very religious people. This church, the Corinthian church, is really unique. Probably one of my favorites in the New Testament, because all of the people here came from a life of paganism, and I don't mean that like a derogatory Christian way. I mean literal paganism, right? Like, I mean, going to the pagan temples and participating in all of those things. Like, they've accepted the gospel, they believe the gospel, they found something greater, they've been connected with a true sense of spiritual nourishment, and so now they're this church. And what's happening throughout this whole chapter 10 is they're going back to the way that they used to live. And I think a lot of times our knee-jerk reaction is, man, Corinthians, you guys are so stupid. Right? Or not you, maybe that's just me. I'm the only judgmental one in here. Sure. You're right. Like, man, you guys are dumb. You're doing stupid stuff too, like idol worship. Like, there's a lot of blurry lines kind of in the Christian life, right? There's a lot of ethical dilemmas, but bowing down to worship an idol, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. It seems like that's a no-brainer. Like, you probably shouldn't do that. But yeah, they're doing that. Like, he is calling them out on all of their blatant sins, like sexual immorality, idolatry. He's calling them out on all of these things because they've chosen a different path. They've assumed a new identity that doesn't match up to the old one. But why do they go back? I mean, let's just think about it for a second. If someone becomes a Christian, like let's say someone grows up in a non-Christian home, they become a Christian, they really become a Christian. They're not faking it till they make it, right? They become a Christian. Who are all of their friends primarily still? Non-Christians. All of their webs of networks are what? Non-Christians. The way they've lived their whole life is as a non-Christian. So all of a sudden, when someone who becomes a Christian then does something that Christians don't necessarily do, we get all up in arms and we're ready to, crucify them or burn them at the stake. How dare you do this? Without even thinking about, this person doesn't know any different. You see, when you become a Christian, God does several things to you. The primary things He does is this. He gives you a brand new heart full of brand new desires, full of brand new volitional expectations and wonders. But those things are not mature. They're not mature at all. You're not instantly Paul the Apostle when you become a Christian, right? Unfortunately. And so even though Paul is calling them out in a very direct way, it's also very gracious. Paul's being incredibly gracious here. He understands, hey, this is the culture you come out of, but you've come to something so much better. I think that's why, if you notice in the verses before, he's reasoning with them. He's not just beating them in the head. Hey man. He's reasoning with them. He's saying, hey, you guys are sensible people. Listen, this is what you're going to do. Your participation with Christ is infinitely more important than the participation with your idols. And ultimately, this is why the church, universal, is so important. Because without the community of the church, none of us would ever grow in our Christian walk. Ever. We never would. Ever. I am directly, I'll be selfish for a second, I am directly the product of all of the various Christian communities I've been a part of. You take one of them apart, I would not be who I am today. Christianity is not a Lone Ranger mission. It's a community mission. And Paul's saying, look, you guys have come from a community. You're in an infinitely better community. You're in the community that your heart has been longing to be a part of. Stop going back to the other community. Stay in this one. Because that's how you're going to mature. That's how you're going to learn to ride this bicycle that you've been given. And this is why church is so crucial for the Corinthians, but also for us. And it's also significant, not just for the accountability factor, but because it's in the church that God gives to be stewards of His table. It's in the midst of the church that he lays a banquet and he invites us to come. Even when we go back on our commitments, even when we return to our idols, he still sets a table in the middle and says, you are my son, you are my daughter, I love you, I have paid for you to be here. Come feast with me. And that's what we need. That's what our soul needs. That is spiritual nourishment at its finest, at its fullest, at the King's table, because that's where the King is present. We need that. His presence is the nourishment that we need. So look, here's how I want to end. How does this? Because how do we apply this? Because this can be some dense things. Can be some hard things, but how do we apply it? And first of all, before I say anything, I want to recommend a book to you, because I think it's really healthy when other people shape your library. Not that I'm really healthy at all. I'm just saying the principle works, right? There's a book by a man called James K. Smith called "You Are What You Love." You are what you love. Incredibly, incredibly important, right? And the idea is it's not necessarily what you love, but it's why you love it. And this week I spent some time talking to some various trainers here at Bona because of the parallels between the spiritual life, the physical life. And so I was just casually kind of asking trainers like, hey, what are some of the themes? You know, people, it's January, so people are, everyone in the world and their mom is dieting and, getting fit and skinny and hot and stuff. And so, what I asked them, what are some common themes why people fall off the bandwagon, right? And you know what? Out of all of the fantastic answers that I heard, which I heard some really great ones, not one trainer, who the people who do this for a living, right? Not one of them said it's a lack of knowledge. Not one of them said, people just really don't know that they shouldn't be eating Doritos all day long. People just really don't know that. No, it's not. It was things like people don't believe that they can really do it. Or sometimes disruptive things in life happen and it gets you off your track. Or people don't have the accountability that's necessary to go through a transformation or something like that. Those are fantastic answers. But none of them have to do with knowledge. They all have to do with behavioral changes. And I think that's really important because the Christian life itself has to do with behavioral changes as well. If we're going to be spiritually disciplined, if we're going to utilize this nourishment that we've been given, there are some behavioral changes that have to happen. In fact, at the deepest level possible, how do we apply this? We have to change not just our mindset about who God is, not just our mindset about who we are, not just our mindset about how much we need His spiritual nourishing, but we have to change our old patterns of the way we've been nourished in the past. And that's why Paul says in 21 and 22, he says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You can't partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He? You can't do both. One of the old ways of nourishing yourself has to die. It has to go by the wayside. The Christian life is a constant denial of who we used to be and an embracing who we are in Christ. That's why, as we've been talking about membership in this season of the life of our church, the number one qualifier for membership is: are you willing to take the next step in obedience to Christ? Are you willing to do that? Which requires a lot of hard work. Which requires a lot of sacrifice. It requires a lot of denying yourself. But let me qualify those things for a second, because immediately when I say hard work, because we're very successful Westerners, I think we have a misconception of what that actually looks like and means. When I say hard work, I think Paul kind of helps us with that really in the short section before. Right? In the short section before, that's when Paul says very famously, you probably have heard this before, when he says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, He will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. And usually, often, we take these verses as, well, God's not going to put me in a position where I can't succeed. Or God's not going to put me in a position where I can't overcome whatever's put in front of me. And my friends, that is radically incorrect. Like, have you ever read the book of Job? Have you read about the lives of the apostles? Or how about Jesus himself? Does this principle just not apply to him? Like, God is going to radically have you in positions and places and times and around people that you, in your own ability, are not going to be able to handle whatsoever. That's why the crux, the most important part of this verse, is not lifting up your self-sustainability. It's saying God is faithful. He is faithful to provide the way out. So our working hard is always in cooperation with God working on our behalf. It's never juxtaposed to it. It's never like, I got to do this, I got to work hard, I got to pull myself up by your bootstraps. I mean, you can do that, that's fine. But you're going to fail. You can say all day long, that's my idol, I'm not going to worship my idol, I'm not going to worship my idol, I'm not going to worship my idol. Well, maybe for a little bit, I'll worship my idol. Or something happens that disrupts your life. Well, I have my idol there, right? And if you've ever been addicted to anything, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Any kind of substance addiction, you know exactly what I'm talking about. My dad used to say all the time, because he was an ex-alcoholic, he used to say, or alcoholic, he used to say all the time, you're fine until your shoelace breaks. And it's true. And as someone with an incredibly addictive personality, I mean, that's real. That's very real. No, the only means of escaping temptation is by being radically dependent on and satisfied in this God who reveals himself at the Lord's table. That's the only way. Not your self-sustainability. Because he has a plan. He has a way out. There are a few things that are more entertaining than Mexican luchador wrestling, right? And do you call it Mexican luchador or just luchador? Whatever. There is just nothing more superbly interesting than watching these high-flying, agility, junkie, guys flying around the ring, literally with zero concern whether they're going to spend the rest of their life in a wheelchair or not. There's just something exhilarating. And about 10 years ago, the WWE, I don't watch that, but I heard that from someone who does, the WWE picked up this luchador, this champion luchador, who was phenomenal. Instant success. The luchadors wear their masks and they're just flamboyant stuff. Instant success. He rose to the top of the rankings or whatever. It was so fun to watch. He was doing stuff that like Rey Mysterio never dreamed of, right? If you don't know who Rey Mysterio is, I cannot help you right now. But then something happened. He was injured. He broke something in his leg, or he broke his leg, sorry. But they kept it under the radar because he finished the match and then they never said anything about it. And they kept it under the radar. But something was different when he would come out to the ring. He wouldn't do his normal entrance stuff, which was off. And he would only be in the ring a couple seconds before he would then roll underneath the ring. And then, miraculously, he would roll out and he would be the same wrestler again, right? And I was like, it was so crazy. But it was, what they were doing is, it was a double. It was another guy dressed up just like him that had the same set, same body composition, right? And then they would fake it, and they did that forever, for a long time. And I don't know if too many people noticed it. But eventually, because of the guy's injury, he wasn't able to work out. So eventually, the body composition between the two became, kind of different. And you were able to tell, that when the chubby guy would roll under the ring, and then this, high-flying Greek god would come out, it's like, well, okay. Something's going on here. But they did it for a long time, and I'm not even really sure why, but here's the point. When God says that he provides a way of escape for us, what he's saying is this: I have a double for you. I have a substitute for you. You're injured, you're broken, you cannot help yourself, but I can help you. And I'm going to help you because I care about you, because I'm compassionate about you, because I love you. I'm going to help you in this situation. We have a double. And our double's name is Jesus. And there's not a temptation that we face that he didn't face. There's not an avenue of human brokenness that he didn't interact with. Yet, where we have failed, he did not fail. It was perfect in every way. Yet, our failures and our brokenness was put on him. He paid the penalty for that. We are given a way out by God because Jesus was given no way out. He's our double. And my friends, this is a game changer. Because not only are we just forgiven for our sins, yes, that's a huge part of it, but we're also empowered. We're empowered to say no to the idols. We're empowered to say no to other sources of faux spiritual nourishment. And we have all access to actual spiritual nourishment that our heart needs and wants. But I don't want to give the facade that it's somewhat painless. Reforming our habits is very difficult. It's like riding a bike. Imagine if you learned to ride a bike on a bike that was broken. And then when you turned right, the bike went left. And when you turned left, the bike went right. And then, by grace, someone gave you a real bike. And you got on it and you're so excited. You're like, man, this is going to be great. What happens? You fall and you fall and you fall. Why? Because on this bike, when you turn right, it turns right. You turn left, it turns left. How do you learn how to ride that bike? Practice. You grind, and you grind, and you grind, and you fail, and you mess up, and you grind some more, and you push, and you claw, and you scratch. And it's not easy. C.S. Lewis put it like this. Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. And at first, perhaps you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right. He's stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed to be done, so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking about the house in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he's building quite a different house from the one you thought. Throwing up a new wing here, putting an extra floor there, running up towers here, making courtyards over there. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace fit for a king in which he intends to dwell. Being a Christian means that we are temples of the living God. The old way in which we live doesn't work anymore. It means that, proverbially speaking, sometimes instead of ice cream, we have to eat green beans. But here's the thing about eating green beans. The more you eat green beans, the more your body begins to crave green beans. The more your body is able to efficiently operate with green beans. The same is very much true in our spiritual lives. The more we pursue to be nourished by Christ, the more we desire Christ. The more he reigns in us, the more escaping we experience from our idols, from other sources of faux nourishment. God provides us sustenance in our deepest spiritual longings in the King's table. I don't know where you're at today, but I know this. I know the King's table provides nourishment for his people. And I know Jesus, the only person who's ever lived that never bowed to an idol, found complete satisfaction in his Father, yet gave away all his accolades, all his favor, even his life. For what purpose? To give us a seat at the table, to be nourished by God himself. Because what our heart longs for deepest is God's presence. Hey, wherever you're at, wherever you are, whether you're religious, irreligious, whether you're a Christian, whether you're non-Christian, whether you're on the fence, man, I'm so glad that you're here. And you are welcome here and you belong here. This is a safe place where we can talk about hard things like this. It's a safe place to belong before you even believe this stuff. I'd encourage you, these are the kinds of things we work out together in community. Be a part of our community.